What's up, everyone? Welcome to Stat Chasing Week 8. My name is Sam Hoppen, and I am your host for the show. Thanks for tuning in today. If you haven't watched the show before, this is where I go through all of the key stats and metrics that I think are important to laying a foundation for understanding what happened this past week, what's happened the past couple weeks to help you make some fantasy football decisions, give you some more information. I know not everyone can watch all of the games. Some people are spending time with others, some are sleeping, but everyone wants to get caught up on the data, and that's what I'm here for today and every week. But before I get into the details, going to talk through each of the stats that I'll be using today. From PFF is where I get all of my routes data. So that's targets per route run and any other route rate metrics. I also use their expected fantasy points model, which is a model that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage and is what I use as a measure of player usage to show which players are getting some of the more high value opportunities in their offense and not necessarily getting all of the opportunities. From NFL Faster, which has the NFL play-by-play data, I get air yards, which is the distance that the ball traveled in the air before it got to the receiver. Weighted opportunity rating, which is a stat that Josh Hermsmeyer created that weights target share and air yard share. Also have RACER, which is receiver air conversion ratio. It's receiving yards divided by air yards and is an efficiency metric showing a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual yards. And then on the flip side, have PACER, which is passing air conversion ratio is passing yards divided by passing air yards. And this, again, shows how well quarterbacks or the receivers are converting their air yards into actual yards. Also have Crosby in the room here chewing on a bone that I might have to take away if it gets too loud. But have quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt, but weights it with interceptions and touchdowns. Also have pass rate over expectation, which is using the NFL Faster model, essentially determines whether a play should or should not be a pass, and then whether teams are passing more or less than expected. Also have CPOE, which is completion percentage over expectation. And again, similar methodology there with showing whether a pass would expect it to be completed. And Crosby's bone is bothering me. I'll be right back. All right. Sorry about that. We're back now. Hopefully he's not too annoying, knowing that the bone is up on my desk now. But finally have some stats popularized by Ben Gretsch himself. Weighted targets per route run, which is targets per route run, but weights air yards and routes run with a scalar included. And essentially pretty much just use this for wide receivers. Sort of shows a little bit of differentiation between receivers that are getting targeted downfield or not. And then high value touches, which is a running back specific metric, is carries inside the 10-yard line and receptions. And then green zone touches, which is any touch inside the opponent's 10-yard line. So I'll be going through these stats position by position to give some comparison across players within the position to help you make your start, sit, waiver, trade decisions, maybe put a little bit of DFS spin on it as well. And then we'll go into a couple of team level situations. A reminder to subscribe to the YouTube channel, become a member for just $5 a month to be able to watch this show live, get early access to it, get access to the Discord and a bunch of other benefits. And one quick final shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who once again this year has graciously been adding timestamps to the YouTube comments for each of the positions and team conversations. So you can skip over me taking away Crosby's bone and get to the good stuff. But speaking of the good stuff, going to throw the first chart up. And like I mentioned, like I've been doing for a couple weeks now, am showing a 5-week rolling average of the different stats. And then we'll switch to a view that's just the past week. And on the quarterback chart, have adjusted yards per attempt on the x-axis, touchdown rate on the y-axis, and the size of a player's bubble as his rushing yards per game. And again, looking for efficiency here because volume is not always what helps with a quarterback in terms of fantasy production. I know I was thinking about this earlier. I had mentioned Jared Goff as someone who could potentially have a good season just based on the volume at which they would throw the ball, the lines being down by a lot in all of their games. And you can see him on the very bottom right part of this chart. And he has not necessarily produced that well, as a fantasy quarterback this season because he hasn't been efficient. The Lions actually haven't thrown the ball quite as much. They've been relatively competitive in some games, even this past week. But one of his, rivals in the NFC North, who's been playing extremely efficiently, once again, Aaron Rodgers, since that week 1 debacle against the Saints, he's looked pretty damn good. He's carried the Packers to 6 straight wins. And outside of week 1, he scored at least 19 fantasy points in every game and at least 24 fantasy points in all but 2 games. He's got a 7.9% touchdown rate, an outstanding 9.6 adjusted yards per attempt. He's doing all this on a 0.93 pacer, so getting, not a ton of help from his receivers, at least not from some of the other quarterbacks that we see. He has an absurd 10.1% CPOE, so he is completing 10% more of his passes than the NFL Faster model would expect him to complete. This is only second behind Kyler Murray's 10.5% CPOE. Those two are just, you can see them right next to each other on the chart, are just going absolutely bananas this year. Green Bay has actually switched up their play calling a little bit this year. They have a 5% pass rate over expectation this year. And that's a little bit of a switch from last year. I believe they were below 0 in pass rate over expectation last year and were content running the ball. And unfortunately, Rodgers might be without a couple of his top receiving options in the game on Thursday night against the Cardinals. Devontae Adams still in the COVID protocol, and just got a notification before I went live that Allen Lazard is now on the COVID reserve list. So I'll be talking about that in a little bit later on as far as who might step up, but I'm still probably rolling Rodgers out there this week if I have him. I don't really think there are that many better options this week. Okay, the next quarterback I'll talk about, and I'm not going to have quite as much this week to talk about just because we obviously had the big bye week in week 7, so not a lot has changed for about a quarter of the league. But the next thing I want to talk about is Derek Carr, and he's looked like a much improved quarterback this year, even amidst the coaching turnover. He's thrown exactly 2 touchdowns in all but one game, and that one game was against the Bears a couple weeks ago. He has a league average 4.5% touchdown rate. He has an 8.7 adjusted yards per attempt and a 2.5% CPOE. Where he's making his money from a fantasy perspective is the passing yards and his volume. He's currently second in the league in passing yards, averaging nearly 325 yards per game. He's second overall, like I said, just behind Tom Brady. So you'd have to think that the passing touchdowns would have to regress at some point and hopefully come through for him. And I'm switching over to the week 7 chart here. But he is one of just 2 quarterbacks, with Lamar Jackson being the other, in the top 8 of passing yards this season to have fewer than 16 passing touchdowns. And he only has 12 on the season. So they're going to their bye week this week. But after that, they get the Giants, the Chiefs, and the Bengals. I'd be comfortable starting him in all 3 of those games if I had to. In the last note I have is that in 2 games under Rich Bisaccia, the Raiders interim head coach, the Raiders have about a 2% pass rate over expectation, which is down from the 4% pass rate over expectation that they had under Gruden. But it's good to see that it's still positive, that they're still throwing the ball a little bit more than expected. Final note on quarterbacks here. I know I talked about the Colts last week, and this is a relatively low bar, but Carson Wentz has posted at least 17 fantasy points in 6 of 7 games this season. Had a decent game this past week in some absolutely brutal and terrible weather against the 49ers. Came away with a win there. Had a nice touchdown pass, a better catch from Michael Pittman, but he's played decent this year from a real football perspective. I believe only has 2 interceptions on the year, maybe 3. I don't remember exactly how many he had on Sunday night, but has looked pretty solid for sure. And I think the Colts could make a run at an AFC wild card down the stretch. All right, moving on to the running back position. On the x-axis of this chart have rushing expected fantasy points and receiving expected fantasy points on the y-axis. And then the size of each player's bubble is their fantasy points over expectation. So you can see players like Najee Harris has a slightly smaller bubble. That's because he's performing worse relative to expectation. And then you have someone like Austin Eckler, who is way outperforming expectation. But the first backfield that I want to talk through is the Denver Broncos backfield. They played Thursday night against the Browns, and last time I talked about them, it was pretty much a 1A, 1B situation with Gordon and Williams, and it's still a lot of the same. It's gotten slightly closer, but neither of them has separated himself, which would be a lot better from a fantasy perspective than what we're actually seeing. Even if it was Gordon, but he leads the backfield in running back touch share, but just barely, 50% to 48%. Gordon has a 54% red zone snap share compared to just 43% for Williams. Gordon is running a route on, and this is interesting, he's running around on 50% of dropbacks, which is actually pretty solid for a running back, but he's seeing fewer targets than Javonte Williams, which is a little confusing. Williams, on the other hand, his routes run rate has been above 40% each of the last 2 weeks, but still only has 1 game, which was week 4, with more routes run than Gordon, and he's at a 36% routes run rate on the season. Now, like I said, Williams is getting more targets, which is helping him with a 0.21 targets per route run rate, which is quite solid. He has seen at least 40% of snaps in every game, but only 2 games above 50%. I think if you are a Javonte Williams stan, and I know a lot of people listening to this and in the Discord are. The good part is that on the season and over the last 4 games, Williams is averaging more receiving expected points. He's at per game. He's at 6.4 per game the last 4 weeks and 5.0 on the season. So not only is he getting a little bit more passing work, but he's getting more valuable passing work. Williams is also averaging 1 more high value touch per game. He's got 3.7 per game to Gordon's 2.9 per game, but there really isn't much indication that the roles between these two are changing. On a PPR points per game basis, both Gordon and Williams are outside the top 24 running backs, but I believe they're both in the top 30. So between the two of them, they have a combined 3 games with more than 15 PPR points. Miraculously, they both scored double-digit PPR points in the game on Thursday, which was only the second time that that's happened this season, and that's because they both ended up scoring a touchdown. But I think both of these guys are solid RB2 options. They're certainly cannibalizing each other's opportunities and crushing each other's ceilings. So unless one of them gets hurt, I don't think there's really any reason why things would change. Now, the Broncos backfield is frustrating, but the Ravens backfield is even more nauseating. It's probably the most annoying one in all of fantasy football, which shouldn't come as a big surprise. And you'd think that there would be value in this backfield because of how much they typically run the ball. But Hayden Winks noted yesterday that the Ravens have moved to 4th overall in neutral script pass rate in the last 4 weeks, which is much different than we're used to seeing. So getting into the backfield a little bit more, after posting 2 games with double-digit PPR points in the first 2 games, Tyson Williams has been inactive for 2 of the past 5 games and has scored a total of 11.7 PPR points in the 3 games that he's played. So there must be something going on behind the scenes that has led to his reduced role. It doesn't really make sense why he played so well and then again has been inactive for 2 games. But I don't know what's going on there. Maybe something comes out this week. Latavius Murray also missed the game this past week, which contributed to Devontae Freeman's snap share hitting a season high 40%. His has actually climbed. His snap share has climbed in each of the last 4 games. And again, it's a relatively low bar for usage, but Latavius Murray seems to be the one constant when he is healthy. He's averaging about 11 opportunities per game. He has at least 9 opportunities in all but 1 game, and he's averaging about 13 per game in the last 3 games. And then behind him, it probably is Devontae Freeman, who's seen the most pass-catching usage with multiple targets in each of the last 3 games. He's averaging 3 targets per game over that span, which has helped contribute to his 3 high-value touches per game in those same 3 games. And without Latavius Murray this past week, Freeman had a solid 5 high-value touches. On the season, he's averaging nearly 1 rushing yard over expectation, which is much better than the negative 1.4 rushing yards over expectation that Murray has, and better than the negative 0.4 rushing yards over expectation that Tyson has. So, like I said, Tyson looked like the guy that Devontae Freeman is because he ran a route on 40% of snaps in each of the first 3 games, but he hasn't been above 30% in the past 2 games that he's played. Meanwhile, Freeman hasn't been above 35% in each of the last 3 games. So the rest of season, my rankings would probably be Latavius Murray, Devontae Freeman, and Tyson Williams. I think of anyone, if anyone has a chance to splash and be a potential league winner down the stretch, it's Tyson Williams because, again, he's like physically looked the best of that bunch. So if you're in a position where you're 6-1, 5-2, you're a little bit weak at the running back position, and you have some extra depth that you're on your bench, I'd rather go out and stash Tyson Williams than potentially deal with Latavius Murray or Devontae Freeman. And then, later on down the road when he gets to week 12, 13, can just drop him if nothing's changed. So moving on to the final backfield, and then have a bunch of different just sort of individual running back notes. But it's the Cardinals running backs. And I believed really all season, and I've said multiple times on here, that Chase Edmonds has the more sustainable role, simply because he's involved as a receiver. And that actually bore out in full this past week, despite, him not having his full workload in the passing game. And despite the Cardinals being in a mostly positive game script, Edmonds ran a route on a season high 77% of dropbacks. He just didn't see the targets, but it's really great to see after it had decreased in each of the last 3 weeks. Unfortunately, he also had a season low 2 high value touches, but got a season high 15 carries, while James Conner, the other guy in this backfield, only got 10 carries. And it was the first time this year that Edmonds had more carries than Conner in a single game. It was also the first time that Edmonds has had double-digit carries since week 4. He also played on a season-high 69% of snaps. So it was still only, like I said, only able to tally 10 PPR points. He still has yet to score a touchdown, and I'm just waiting for it, because on the season, his total expected fantasy points has been quite large just because of his workload. And he just hasn't been able to find the full production from a fantasy perspective because he hasn't found the end zone. And James Conner had the more productive day from a fantasy perspective this past week, scoring just over a dozen PPR points. He did it on some efficiency, though. He had a season low 30% snap rate, and this was his first time below 40% since week 3. And like I said, he's still only involved as a rusher. He has just 5 targets total on the season. He's a touchdown reliant player. And again, he bailed managers out this past week with a TD of his own late in the game. And it was the first game of the season that James Conner failed to record a high value touch of his own. And Edmonds actually had the lone green zone touch in this game. I believe Conner's touchdown came from about 18, 19 yards out of the end zone. So I hope that this is a sign to come for more of Chase Edmonds. I believe, I don't remember if it was last week, the week before, but he had been dealing with an injury, and I just think he's clearly the better back in that backfield. So like I said, have a bunch of other just random nuggets that I thought were interesting from this past week. And I already have a note to myself to talk about the Buffalo Bills backfield next week, and thought about talking about them this week, but want to see how things shape out in their first game post-bye, especially since they should be in a heavily positive game script against the Dolphins. But first note here, Michael Carter led the league with 9 high-value touches on Sunday. Now, Alvin Kamara had, I think, about a dozen on Monday, so I'm cutting corners there. But this also came in the same game that Ty Johnson had the third most high-value touches with 7. Adam Levitan on Twitter pointed out that with Tevin Coleman inactive, and again, Johnson missed some time due to a concussion in the game this past Sunday. But Michael Carter had season highs in routes run, snaps, targets, and catches. So maybe things are changing. Maybe with Mike White at quarterback, they rely a little bit more on the rookie running back. So certainly encouraging. Ben Gretsch noted in his newsletter that Royce Freeman got a lot of work late with PJ Walker in the game, but Chuba Hubbard still got 80% of the running back touches in their game against the Giants. So continuing to push him out there whenever I get a chance. David Johnson saw a season high 12 touches in week 7, and it was the first time this season that he got more than 8 touches. Malcolm Brown got the first 4 backfield touches of the game against the Falcons. He got a whopping 9 yards, but he suffered a quad injury and is now going to miss at least the next 3 games now that he's on injured reserve. And after he left the game, Myles Gaskin handled 19 of the team's 28 backfield touches. Savon Ahmed saw the other 9. So I believe the Dolphins actually picked up Duke Johnson today as well. I saw this afternoon. And I hope that doesn't take away receiving opportunity from Myles Gaskin, because I believe I mentioned it last week. Gaskin has clearly been their best pass catching back this season. Speaking of pass catching backs, JaMycal Hasty clearly has that role on lockdown in San Francisco. In his past 2 healthy games, Hasty has seen 5 and 6 targets, and the rest of the 49ers running backs, I say running backs specifically to exclude Kyle Juszczyk, but the rest of the 49ers running backs have a total of 7 targets combined on the season. Now, that said, Elijah Mitchell still handled 75% of the running back touches. He has at least 60% of running back touches in every single game that he's played. And I noted yesterday on Twitter that I think Elijah Mitchell could potentially be one of the league winners that we're talking about down the stretch, because he has that, at least all of the rushing work on lockdown. One final note here, and then I'll get to the wide receivers, but Rashaad Penny returned from injury this past week and played on 36% of snaps, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that was actually right behind Alex Collins, who had a 39% snap share. Collins was given 17 opportunities, which was 11 more than Penny's 6 opportunities, but the 39% snap share that Collins had was his lowest that he's seen since Chris Carson has been out. But he still had at least 17 opportunities in each of the last 3 weeks. I think Penny is certainly worth an add if he's not already on a roster and he's still out there, because even if Pete Carroll says he's looking for Geno Smith to step up, he clearly does not trust him in the slightest and just wants to run the ball whenever possible. So moving on to the wide receiver position, have targets per route run on the x-axis, air yards market share on the y-axis, and then size as the fantasy points over expectation, and that's per game. So I'm going to kick off the wide receiver position talking about the Panthers wide receivers. Got DJ Moore as the cover boy for the episode today, but Sam Darnold he's down bad. He got benched for PJ Walker, and he's played terribly during their 4-game losing streak. But what does that mean for his receivers? Well, first of all, DJ Moore, he's going to be fine. I may just need to downgrade him slightly from where he was to more of a low-end wide receiver 1 than a locked and loaded wide receiver 1. But over the past 4 games during that stretch for Darnold, Moore is averaging 10.5 targets per game. He's got a whopping 38% air yard share and 28% target share for a solid 0.66 whopper. He has a 0.64 weighted targets per route run. He's averaging nearly 20 receiving expected points per game and has negative 3.3 fantasy points over expectation per game in that stretch too. So that's probably part of Darnold's performance seeping in there and not being able to convert on that. But he's also run a route on 95% of dropbacks. He has an 11.9 yard average depth of target, which is a little higher than what it had been in the first couple weeks. But I'm not worried about them because I believe league average is right around 11.2. But he has just 2 touchdowns. Still want to see those go up, but apparently DJ Moore can't have his cake and eat it too, unfortunately. Now, obviously, I think DJ Moore managers are just fine at this point. They're not freaking out too much, but the talk of the town is Robbie Anderson, who's been one of the biggest busts of the year so far, even with a 6th or 7th round ADP. So here's a couple comparison between Robbie's first 3 games and his last 4 games. So in his first 3 games, he had a 17.7 yard average depth of target, a 45% catch rate, 3.7 targets per game, and 34 receiving yards per game. Now, the 3.7 targets per game and 34 receiving yards per game don't sound that great. But for the past 4 weeks, he's got a 10.6 yard average depth of target. So that's come down nearly 7 yards. And usually that means the catch rate would go up, but his catch rate is now down at 34%, which is 11% down from before. And he's averaging 9.5 targets per game in the last 4 games and only has 25 receiving yards per game to boot. So I think he's certainly a more palatable start in DFS because he's getting the volume. Like, the volume is there. 9.5 targets, not a lot of receivers get that kind of work. And you can see his bubble here where I'm using on the cursor. It's basically right where the 2 dotted lines overlap, which signify league median. But his bubble is extremely small. So he has a very few fantasy points over expectation, negative fantasy points over expectation. So it's a wait and see at this point if he can start to convert that. But the good thing is that it's pretty concentrated between those 2 players. Over the last 4 weeks, no other Panthers wide receiver has gotten more than 5 total targets across all the games. But that's a little stat pull. But Keith Kirkwood did get 5 in the game this past week, thanks to Terrace Marshall being sidelined with a concussion. And Kirkwood had a decent day. He had a 13% target share, 0.23 targets per route run, only 48% route run rate, and 48 air yards. So he could fill in and likely will be the fill-in for Marshall if he misses more time. But don't think I want any third receiver in this offense while Darnold continues to play like he's still playing for Adam Gase. The next set of wide receivers that I'm going to talk about are the Eagles wide receivers. And I still think that Devontae Smith is a really good option and a wide receiver 3. Over the last 5 games, he's had a little bit of DJ Moore on him. He hasn't scored since week 1, so he'll continue to show up in most buy low models. But again, over his last 5 games, he's scored double-digit PPR points in 3 of them. He's running a route on 95% of dropbacks. He's the only Philly wide receiver over 85%. in that span, has a 33% air yard share and 22% target share. Both his 0.49 weighted targets per route run and 0.49 Whopper lead the team. And I think this may actually be a case where Jaylen is hurting his receiver ceiling. He has a negative 2.4 CPOE since week 3. But the big question is who the wide receiver 2 in Philly is. And that still remains to be seen. I think whoever the wide receiver 2 is could have some weekly value, especially in DFS, because the Eagles are still 11th in pass rate over expectation at around 2.5%. They certainly don't have the total volume that some of those other teams have. But fortunately, it's just between Jalen Reagor and Quez Watkins. They're both averaging a little over 7 PPR points per game. So not great, but mainly because they're cannibalizing each other's targets. And both of them could see some more opportunities with Ertz gone. But after starting the season with 6, 5, and 8 targets in each of the first 3 games, Reagor has had a total of just 11 targets since week 4 and no more than 5 targets in a single game. It's not much better for Watkins, but his targets per game have more than doubled from weeks 1 to 3 to weeks 4 to 7. Each of them has had a routes run rate over 75% in each of the last 3 games. And I think at this point, Watkins is just the better player, and he's getting more valuable targets. He's averaging 8.4 receiving expected points per game, has a negative 1.6 FPO per game over his last 5 compared to just under 6 receiving expected points per game for Reagor. So I lean Quez Watkins in that. You can see Watkins over the last 5 weeks on the chart is not massively ahead of Reagor, but is ahead of him in both air yard share and weighted targets per route run. The final wide receiver group I want to talk through is the Lions wide receivers, because even though DeAndre Swift and TJ Hawkinson are really their primary targets, a couple of guys have come on late for Detroit, and unfortunately, my guy Quintez Cephas is out, I believe, for the year with a broken collarbone. So that's opened up some opportunities. But I'll start with Khalif Raymond, who actually had a 10-target game back in week 3. And without Cephas in the lineup the last 2 weeks, Raymond has had back-to-back games with a routes run rate above 92% when he hadn't been above 80% in a single game all season. Before that, he has 15 targets combined over the last 2 games and at least a dozen PPR points in 3 of his last 5 games, one with 9.7, so pretty close there. And he actually leads the team with an average of 75 air yards per game since week 3, which is good for a 35% air yard share and a really solid 0.52 weighted targets per route run. You see him up on the chart here in this top right corner near Michael Pittman, Nico Collins, who I didn't realize is on the chart here, DK Metcalf for this past week. So had a really solid past week, but the only other guy that is unfortunately ruining all my charts and data thanks to his name, and is probably the reason he's not showing up on here, but it's Amon-Ra St. Brown, the rookie wide receiver. Actually, the reason he doesn't show up is because he'd been playing pretty well. He had 3 straight games of at least 7 targets, and then Sunday happened. He played 66% of the Lions snaps, but was not targeted at all, which doesn't really make sense because Goff had said the other week that he wanted to get St. Brown more involved, but I guess that stopped this past week. I'm not really sure what happened, but in any case, Khalif Raymond is now the clear wide receiver 1 and St. Brown, the wide receiver 2. In that offense, they're obviously, like I said, still competing with DeAndre Swift and TJ Hawkinson, but I'd rather have Khalif Raymond over either of the two Eagles wide receivers that I mentioned in Rager and Watkins. Obviously, Smith is above Raymond, but I honestly wouldn't fault you if you wanted Khalif Raymond over Robbie Anderson for the rest of the season. And I think that's more of a testament to how poorly Robbie's been playing than how good Raymond is, but the point stands. So Khalif Raymond in a pretty solid role here moving forward. A couple other one-off nuggets for the wide receiver position. This is from Jacob Gibbs from CBS. Darius Slayton led the league in air yard share in week 7 with a 63% share. You can see him up on the top of the chart here. He had 134 air yards on Sunday, which was the 6th most in week 7. Obviously, the Giants wide receivers were a mess with nobody playing, but I've always been a Darius Slayton fan. So if he gets playing time, then I think he certainly has an opportunity. And now that I mention it, I'm so shocked that Marquise Brown is not much higher on this. He had 321 air yards on Sunday, which I tweeted out the other night, and that's just absurd. Like, nobody's had over 300 yards in a single game this season besides him. Obviously, Rashaad Bateman showing up on the chart here, but that's 321 is, whew, that's a lot. I had a note on the Jets running backs, but now have one on the Jets wide receivers. Jamison Crowder had a season-high 91% routes run rate, while Corey Davis was only at 66% in their blowout loss against the Patriots. I think, if you think things are bad for Robbie Anderson, then look no further than Elijah Moore, who has a measly 35% catch rate on the season and only 79 yards total on the season. So hopefully Mike White unlocks Elijah Moore's ceiling as well. And then finally, with Will Fuller and Devontae Parker out of the lineup for the Dolphins the last 3 weeks, Waddle's seen an average of 9 targets per game, which is slightly higher than the 7.75 targets per game he saw in the first 4 weeks, but he's still run a route on at least 80% of dropbacks in every game this season. And, we talk about players earning targets, and he's certainly earned enough targets of his own. So flipping over here to the tight end position, I mentioned that Devontae Adams could be out Thursday. Now Allen Lazard could be out Thursday, which would be a shame. If you don't know, I'm a Packers fan, so I'm hoping at least one of them is active, but this could open up some opportunities for Robert Big Bob Tonyan, and it's been a slow start to the season for him after being drafted as a top 10 tight end. He has at least 14 PPR points in only 2 games this season, including this past week, and he has 3 or fewer PPR points in every other game this season. So it's really bad from that perspective. But when I look into it more, the peripheral numbers haven't actually been that bad over the last 5 weeks. Here are some of his stats. He's got a 12% target share, 3.6 targets per game, a 72% routes run rate, which is really good. Only a 0.14 targets per route run rate. But what's most frustrating is he only has 1 receiving expected points per game more than Mercedes Lewis, who is running around on 25% of dropbacks this season. Like, what are we doing here? I don't really get it. But yeah, if one or both of Adams and Lazard are out, then I would more than happily start Robert Tonyan on Thursday night. I'm going to switch over to the week 7 chart because I'm going to talk about both of the Philly tight ends, one of which who now plays for Arizona. But let's start with the current Philly tight end, Dallas Goedert. I'm only looking at week 7, and he had in his first game without Ertz, had an 85% route run rate, which was a season high. He had 5 targets, which was tied for a season high. He had double-digit PPR points for the third time this season, a season high 70 receiving yards and 99 air yards. And it was his first game above 35 air yards on the season. So was being used as a downfield threat. I think he's locked in as a tight end 1 the rest of the season, especially, like I said, with Philly having one of the higher pass rates over expectation in the league. Now onto his dusty friend, Zach Ertz. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, and he freaking caught a long touchdown pass and dusted some members of the Texans secondary. He ran a route on 56% of dropbacks, which is about on par with where he was at in Philly. He scored a season high 16 PPR points on the back of that long touchdown that I mentioned. But his 5 targets were his fewest since week 1, still had a healthy 0.26 targets per out run in the game. Rest of season, I'd rather have Goedert, than Ertz because of the pass heaviness of the Eagles and it being the target share being a little bit more condensed. It seems like the Cardinals just want to get everyone involved and not make anyone receiver, pass catcher a focal point, which from a real football perspective is great, but from a fantasy football perspective is quite frustrating. 2 final notes before I get into our team-by-team overviews. This is from Ben Gretsch. Also, Noah Fant has now run a route on more than 80% of dropbacks in 4 straight games after being under 75% in each of the first 3 weeks. And he's having a really solid year so far. He's currently the tight end 10 in PPR points per game. So, yeah, just a really solid year for Fant. Some more Colts propaganda just for my buddy Eric. This is from John Paulson. Jack Doyle ran more routes. Jack Doyle had 20 routes. He had more routes than Alie-Cox, who had 12. But Alie-Cox had 3 receptions for 25 yards and a touchdown. He has 50 yards and or a touchdown in 4 straight games, and he's 11th among qualified tight ends in yards per route run. So, again, you could do a lot worse at the position. So I think could be a decent tight end fill-in if you get hit with a bye week issue. So let's get into the team-by-team previews. And going to start off with the Cincinnati Bengals. And oh boy, let us rejoice because the Cincinnati Bengals, their pass rate over expectation has gone up in each of the last 5 weeks. It's topped out at a season high 8.2% in their week 7 victory. And you could even see it too during the game. They were up 10. The first drive that they were up 10 in the second half, they were continuing to throw the ball and weren't just trying to run the clock out and get out of there with a victory, which was huge. Now, in the second drive is when they started to lean a little bit more run heavy, but it's fantastic to see because I've mentioned a couple times on this show that this team can't live on efficiency all year. I mean, maybe it could, but we don't want it to live on efficiency all year. So from a fantasy perspective, Joe Burrow didn't start off too hot. He had 3 straight games below 20 fantasy points, but now he's had at least 22 in 3 of his last 4 games. And I think he's firmly in the quarterback 1 conversation, not overall, but a top 12 quarterback. He's got an excellent 8.1% touchdown rate on top of a 9.2 adjusted yards per attempt, 5.5% CPOE on the season as well. He's starting to look every bit the quarterback that we and this Bengal team expected him to be. They're rolling. As far as the backfield, when healthy, it's dominated by Joe Mixon. He only played on 54% of snaps this past week, but again, that was in a blowout spot against the Ravens, and he scored a touchdown in each of his last 4 seasons on the season, and this includes the game that he left early as well. But Mixon has a 70% running back touch share so far, so that's some RB1 usage. Chris Evans, I think, has shown some flashes in a couple spots, but Samaje Perine, who broke off a long touchdown of his own this past week, I think is commanding the backup spot right now. You can see his snap rate is just below 50%, and that's again partly due to the game that Mixon missed most of a couple weeks ago. But wrapping up the Bengals conversation with their pass catchers, and I mentioned on Twitter today that the Bengals remain an extremely concentrated passing attack, but it's mostly between T. Higgins and Ja'Marr Chase right now. Boyd's 21% target share still looks solid. Like it's good, and you'd take that, but he's not getting the valuable targets so far this season. So I'm going to share a couple stats on receiving expected points so far this season. So Higgins is actually leading the team this season at 14.5 per game. He's obviously missed a couple games, but he's averaging -2 fantasy points over expectation per game on the season and -5.3 since week 5. Those are the 3 games that he's played. And you can see on the chart here, you can barely see the dot there. Chase is second on the team at 12.9 receiving EP per game, but he's at 7.9 fantasy points over expectation per game. Tyler Boyd is next at 9.8 receiving EP per game and 0.4 fantasy points over expectation. And then again, these are all season-long numbers, but CJ Uzomah is at 4.7 receiving EP per game and 5.7 fantasy points over expectation. As you can see, he's obviously at 7.7 per game over the last 5. So what does this mean? Well, Ja'Marr Chase is crushing it. That's not news. He could see some negative regression, but that's not scaring me at all. This honestly just makes me most optimistic for T. Higgins because we just haven't seen the big blow-up game from him, but I do think it's coming. He doesn't have more than 16 PPR points in a game this season, and I believe he had an end zone target this past week. Could have hauled one in if not for a better pass from Burrow, but his time is coming. The biggest hit from a production perspective could and likely will come from CJ Uzomah. And I want to give a quick shout out to my buddy Sam Sherman, who touted him in DFS this past week and absolutely crushed it. And Uzomah's actually maintained a really solid 76% routes run rate this season, which I didn't expect to hold. And so I think the biggest question mark still remains Tyler Boyd. And here's my advice. I think you start him as a wide receiver 4 with some upside, but much less upside than he had entering the season. And I think if someone is frustrated by him, and they likely are because they're not getting a ton out of him, then you could try doing a 2-for-1 or a 1-for-2 where you send one player, have them add Boyd, sort of a throw-in for them to upgrade at a position, whether it's tight end, running back, quarterback, whatever, and sort of buy low in that situation. I don't know if I'm aggressively targeting Boyd, but hopefully the increased volume for the Bengals helps Boyd just a little bit. Last team here is the Atlanta Falcons. And similar to the Bengals, they're starting to figure things out. Their pass rate over expectation has risen each of the last 3 weeks. They've been at 5.4% and 6.1% the last 2 weeks. But Matt Ryan, he is what he is. He's not the guy. I mean, he's the guy for the Falcons. He's our quarterback, as Arthur Smith would say. But he's league average in most stats right now, 1.1% CPOE, 4.9% touchdown rate, 7.1 adjusted yards per attempt. So he's fine. He's had 2 straight games. He had 2 straight games above 20 fantasy points, but then fell back down to 17.6 this past week. And now he scored fewer than 18 fantasy points in 2/3 of his games. But he's playing well enough to support his pass catchers, which I'll get to in a minute. Before I get to them, I'm going to talk about the running backs, or at least the players in the Atlanta backfield. And I'll kick things off with Cordarrelle Patterson, who continues to remain involved following the bye week. And at this point, we need to just accept that he is part of that offense. He ran a season high 67% of routes on Sunday. He's averaging 16.2 opportunities per game since week 2. He did have his lowest high value touch count since week 1 with only 3 this past week, but I'm not worried about that because he played 73% of snaps, which was a season high, and is the first time he's been above 60% all season. So Patterson, I think a high-end running back 2 going forward. Now, if you have Mike Davis and for some reason have relied on him, you have to be a little bit worried. He tied his season low in snaps at 60%, which isn't terrible, but he only got 4 carries all game, didn't get a single high value touch. And it wasn't like this game was out of hand for them either. The Falcons were in a game script that didn't force them to throw the ball. So Patterson clearly seems to be like the running back 1 and is probably, like I said, an RB2 for the rest of the season. I think Davis is at probably an RB4, especially if they continue to pass the ball. And I teased it. So I teased it a minute ago, but Ryan's average performance is not necessarily spelling doom for his pass catchers, though Calvin Ridley's not showing the season we had hoped for, but he has double-digit PPR points in every game this season. He's still the wide receiver 27 on the season, so he's not winning weeks for you, but I don't really think he's killing you that much each week. And again, these are completely different situations. I know that, but Robbie Anderson, when you started him, he's killing you. And it's a little bit more palatable to bench him. And you're not going to bench Calvin Ridley, but he's got a really strong 20 receiving EP per game. But again, his fantasy points over expectation is near the bottom of the league at negative 5.7 per game over the season. He's at negative 8 per game in the past 5 weeks, which is just abysmal. He's run a route on 92% of dropbacks this season. He's the only receiver above 70% on the season for the Falcons, and has double-digit targets in every game since week 2. So I think he's a great buy low. Again, especially that given that the Falcons are past their bye, you can just roll him out every single week and hope that he just finally finds the end zone again. Now, as far as the ancillary pieces, it's really just Russell Gage or Olamide Zaccheaus. Gage has only played in 3 games this season, but has a targets per out run of 0.24 or better in each of his last 2 games. He has 766 targets in those 2 games. He had 80 air yards this past week, which was second on the team behind only Kyle Pitts, who I'll talk here in a minute. But Zaccheaus is just completely a non-factor when Gage is in the lineup. With Gage back this past week, Zacchaeus only ran a route on 7% of dropbacks. That said, Gage has only been at 56 and 60% his last 2 games. So I'd rather roster Russell Gage at this point. I'd expect that routes rate to rise to the sort of 80% rate that he had in week 1. But neither of them have seen more than 7 targets in a game. Now, someone who has seen more than 7 targets in a game is Kyle Pitts. And oh man, I'm getting excited about him. He's turning out to be just who we thought he was. Again, this is from Jacob Gibbs pointing out the air yard share from this past week. Kyle Pitts was at 42%, and Pitts is just the 3rd tight end to post an air yard share above 40% in a game in 2021. He has back-to-back games with at least 100 receiving yards and at least 23 PPR fantasy points. The dude's a stud. He's a top 4, maybe top 3 tight end rest of season. So if you bought low, if you were able to buy low on him, then you are sitting pretty right now for the rest of the season. All right. That's going to do it for the show today. Hope you all enjoyed it. Remember to tune into the show tomorrow night, 9:15 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be back here next week with Stat Chasing. Again, subscribe to the YouTube. Become a Discord member for just $5 a month. Enjoy week 8. Good luck. And we'll see you all next week.